Hey folks, so we are continuing to journey west across North America, and this lecture focuses on forests of California, primarily the Sierra Nevada. I've had a chance to travel out to Yosemite National Park, also the Kings Canyon Sequoia National Park, and then most recently to visit my brother and sister-in-law at Lake Tahoe, which is what this photo is. And these are really diverse forests that I am still learning lots about. So welcome to Forests of the Sierra Nevada. So let's talk briefly first about California geography. Just to orient ourselves, we have our last lecture, we talked about the Coast Range, which you can see is extending here along the coast in Northern California. So this is areas where you've got Redwood National Park up here. We also have the southern extent of the Cascade Range in this into California. I had a chance to visit Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is kind of at this interesting confluence of several different geographies, but it's considered to be the south part of the Cascades. And then Lake Tahoe here at the Bend in California. And then we have the Sierra Nevada extending down here in Eastern California. And to the east of it is the some of the driest parts of the United States, Great Basin area, which is a lot of Nevada. Also, you can see Death Valley National Park in the Mojave, that's just south of the Sierra Nevada. And then I also want to point out, we're going to talk a little bit about chaparral habitat, which is here along the coast in Southern California. So not part of the Sierra Nevada, but something that is pretty important. And then, of course, we have all these different factors that help predict forest type. For this set of lectures, I'm going to focus on precipitation, which is definitely a limiting factor in many forest types in the Western United States. First, we've got our Coast Range, and you can see this purple is the very highest rainfall in California, Northern California. So this is where we see those coast redwood forests around Redwood National Park, and then Muir Woods in San Francisco. Which is just north of San Francisco. And then we have, pretty high rainfall in the Sierra Nevada that extends through the Sierra Nevada. So those are still pretty wet areas that we're going to focus on. And then I also want to point out the chaparral habitat, which is down here in Southern California along the coastline. So these are much more drought prone areas, but you can see a lot of the rainfall. We do have a bit of a rain effect with the Pacific Ocean bringing lots of rainfall. And remember also that a lot of California is in a Mediterranean climate where the precipitation is seasonal. So you have dry summers, but cooler, wet winters. And that's especially true in the northern part of California, but also you have some very hot, dry summers in the southern part of the state. So first we're going to talk about sort of a shrub habitat, not really a forest, but it looks like this. I was really struck by this image of chaparral habitat. You can see it looks pretty uniform, but it's actually quite diverse shrubland that's in Southern California. And you can see it's on these kind of foothill areas, and the shrubs are very, very dense. So it is shaped by its Mediterranean climate. On the map here of California, this is showing the chaparral habitat in kind of a yellow green color, right? So extending along the southern coast, right? These are definitely shaped by a Mediterranean climate. So summers are very hot, dry, and drought prone. Winters are where you've got all the rainfall. This top photo shows where firefighters are doing a prescribed fire. These are areas that have kind of an interesting fire interval. When you look at them, you might think that it is frequent low-level fires, but that is actually not the case. These chaparral habitats tend to burn in a 30 to 50-year interval, and it's catastrophic fire. So the shrubs have these adaptations to resprout from root crowns and regenerate following fire. But the leaves themselves actually have terpenes in them that contributes to burning very, very hot. And so these habitats do tend to be fire prone. Fires also climb up into valleys. So you can see that it's in this valley here, you can see a lot of bare rock, but you can see shrub layers. And then as you go up into the valley, you've got more of a woodland type habitat. And so this habitat is moisture limited. So that's why there's no forest there. It's a woodland zone. So, and interestingly, it's pretty diverse. So there's more than 100 species of evergreen shrubs, and many, if not most of them, are in the Ericaceae or the heath family, and they have compounds in their leaves that aid in spreading catastrophic fire. So again, these are woodlands, shrub zones that are in southern part of California along the coastline. And next, we're going to move into the mountains in the Sierra Nevada proper, right? So this mountain range extending here. And, these are high mountains. Mount Whitney is the highest point in California. It's in Yosemite. I think it's at Yosemite National Park. I know the second highest peak, Mount Dana, is in Yosemite. I had the chance to climb that with my best friend growing up, who was a seasonal ranger at Yosemite National Park for several years. But Mount Whitney is at 14,494 feet. So definitely some really tall, jagged mountains. And so, right, when we talk about the Sierra Nevadas, we're talking about a really big range in elevation. So 1,500 feet in foothills up to 14,000 feet and above. And so you can really easily delineate these forest types by elevation. Now, granted, right, I want to make it clear that it's not, elevation is not really the factor at play here, right? It's not that the trees are adapted for high elevations, right? Elevation in this case is a proxy for temperature and precipitation. So remember, as you go up mountains, you tend to get higher levels of precipitation and also cooler temperatures. So it's not the elevation itself, but we can use elevation as a way to delineate these forests. And we're going to focus on, there's lots of variety here. With the woodland forest, right? This is pinyon, pine, juniper, right? Shown in this kind of light green here along the edge, and then going up into ponderosa pine forest. This is a familiar forest type, maybe from the Rockies, one that hopefully you'll get a chance to see. And then Sierra mixed conifer is this bright green, and you can see this is a pretty extensive forest type. This is what we're calling the montane zone. And these are pretty diverse coniferous forests. And then as you get into the highest elevations, you get into subalpine conifer forests. So that's the subalpine forest type that we'll look at. And so if you look at this in profile, right, so we're going to focus actually on the western side of the Sierra. The eastern side of the Sierra is also interesting, but it's mostly grades into the Great Basin. It kind of drops off precipitously. And so it becomes very moisture limited. And so those forest types look pretty, if you visited there, you might think, oh, this looks like pinyon, pine, juniper woodlands that are common throughout much of the West. So that woodland forest is what you'd find on the east side, but we're going to focus on the west side. So the very lowest elevation, you get into chaparral habitat, depending on where you are in the state. And then we'll talk about the foothills and woodland forests. So that's a lot of pinyon, pine, juniper. Then lower montane, right, is what we're calling this submontane forest. Upper montane is what we're calling montane forest. And then subalpine, right, where you start running into limitations in temperature for forests. So we actually do reach elevational tree line in the Sierras because they're quite tall. And so looking at these again, right, so these are the forest types and the types of trees that you'll find in them, right? So you've got your woodland forests at the lowest elevation. And so again, these look like woodlands, right, which are scattered trees. They're precipitation limited in these lower elevations. And in this case, also limited by seasonality precipitation. And so we'll look at the trees here, but they're actually kind of scrubby. I mean, they're legit trees. They're not shrubs, but pretty low statured scattered trees, not a closed canopy forest. And then we'll see submontane. We've got ponderosa pine and California black oak, both drought tolerant species. And then the most extensive forest is a mixed coniferous forest, lots of different trees, all mostly evergreen trees in this zone. And then we'll get into the highest elevations with fir and pines at these elevations ranging all the way up to climatic tree line. So for each of these forest types, I'm going to show you a couple pictures so you get a sense of what they look like. Hopefully you'll have a chance to visit them. And then we'll also talk about the structure of the forest, some of the most important species, environmental drivers, ecology, etc. So going into our first habitat type, so you might notice, right, these look like, these are trees, right, but they're pretty short in stature, and you can see space between them. If you look at the ground, you can see open areas, right? So this is not a true forest, it's more of a woodland. And that, in this case, this is driven by moisture limitations. You can also see up here in the back hills, right, it looks a little bit flatter, right? So that's grading up into chaparral habitat, which is actually above these woodland forests. So that's kind of interesting that you have kind of a woodland with scattered low statured trees, and then you've got chaparral shrub habitat above that. But it's a transition zone that's kind of between chaparral and then closed conifer forests. Depending on, right, so California is a big state, so it's hard to pinpoint elevations exactly because it really depends on whether you're the northern or southern part of the Sierra. But and I have here, you know, that the tree canopy is closed and that the crowns are short and broad. But I think when you see this other photo, you can see, I don't know, I'm not sure I'd argue that that's a closed tree canopy. It looks more like a woodland to me. But in any case, the trees are not high, they're pretty low. And this annual precipitation is right on the borderland of shrub versus tree forest canopy, right? 15 inches of rainfall per year is kind of our limitation between a woodland versus a forest. And the other really notable thing is that very little of this rainfall falls during the growing season. So these are more drought prone and may have more of a woodland feel just because of that fact, right? So when the trees are dormant, or maybe they're evergreen, which actually they are, that's to take advantage of that precipitation that occurs during the winter. Principal species here are foothills or gray pines. This is Pinus sabbatiana. This might look a little bit familiar to you. These pine cones look a lot like coulter pine, Pinus coulteri, which are the largest and heaviest cones. And I think it's really interesting because these are short statured trees. You can see where it gets its gray pine kind of name here. The foliage is kind of grayish, and then it's got these really armed trees. This is the range map for Pinus sabbatiana. So you can see this is the Central Valley in California, so it's mostly agriculture, and then it kind of it fringes this edge in these areas that are pretty water limited. And then blue oak is one of the many species of live oaks in California. This is Quercus douglasii. And you can see it looks a little bit like our live oak in North Carolina, or Quercus virginiana. It has these elongated acorns, and you can see thick evergreen leaves that enable it to do some photosynthesizing during the winter months when there's more rainfall. Moving on, so we're going into a little bit higher elevations and then closed canopy forest with some drought tolerant species. So this is a transition between the woodland zone and the coniferous montane zone, found at 3,000 to 5,000 feet, again, depending on where you are latitudinally. And the structure for this forest is that it is a closed canopy. A lot of these are secondary growth forests. The ponderosa pine is a valuable species and was cut. There can be good structure here. So I'm at the edge of a cut looking into the forest, and you can see a variation in age. There's some canopy species for sure, but also a pretty developed mid-story. Not a whole lot in the herbaceous layer. And you can also see a lot of downed fuels here. So this is something that is a concern from a wildfire risk, right? That you have an accumulation of these fuels. And because it's so dry, sometimes these fuels they take much longer to break down than they would in the east. They don't have quite the rot and insects that break the woody debris down so quickly. So often you'll see forests where they've piled some of the debris into piles, which they will burn during seasons when it's safe to do so, to try and reduce those fuel layers. And then if we're looking at this, a primary species is ponderosa pine. This is a species we learn in lab by the cone. Looks quite a bit like loblolly pine. It's got very orangey bark. You can see ponderosa pine is widespread in the Western North America. These different colors indicate different varieties of ponderosa pine, which we didn't really get into. And then we also have California black oak, which this is almost restricted to California, Quercus kellogii. And you can see this is a tree with a spreading crown. This is something that I spotted while I was driving up to Lhasa National Park. So it's got leaves that might, to me, they look a little bit like Quercus rubra, var rubra. And then the acorns have pretty deep caps. You can definitely tell it's a red oak from the bristle tips and the shingles on the caps. But those are two principal species in this submontane zone. So both a pine tree as well as a broadleaf oak tree. And then this shot is one that hopefully you'll get a chance to see in person yourselves. This is looking into Yosemite Valley. And we're going to move on and talk about the montane forest zone. From this standpoint, it does not look very diverse, but there's quite a few different species of trees depending on where you are. But all of them share this, they're coniferous trees. There are some areas where you can see on the slopes that are not vegetated. And this is El Capitan, of course, looking into the valley, Yosemite Falls. And this is a really extensive forest type, and it has a lot more diversity that I'm going to be able to capture in this lecture. But these are forests that are found at 5,000 to 7,000 feet in elevation. And it's the most extensive forest type in California, but also extends into Oregon. This forest type you might compare it to the montane forests that are in the Rocky Mountains. But if you think about it, right, the Sierra Nevada have much higher rainfall than the Rockies. The Rockies are relatively dry. And so you have a lot more diversity and a lot more species. And there's a lot more variation as a result of that in the Sierra Nevadas. And you can see, I think, from the photos that this is definitely a closed canopy forest. These areas do get high levels of snowfall in the wintertime. So these pointed crowns are definitely an advantage. And then also that seasonality of precipitation, evergreen is kind of the way to go if you have a lot of your rainfall occurring during the winter months. And so principal species, right? So we have ponderosa pine grading into these elevations, right? This is a drought tolerant species. So you might expect as the climate warms and we get more droughts, that ponderosa pine may continue to climb those slopes. We also have Douglas fir, right? This is Pseudotsuga menziesii, var menziesii, right? So this is still the West Coast version of Douglas fir, and you can see it has these really large crowns found. This is not the whole range map, but I guess this is, well, no, actually I'm wrong. This photo is not Douglas fir. It's actually sugar pine shown in bold, right? Which I should have seen my cue there. Sugar pine, which has right, we learned this in lab, this is Pinus lambertiana, has these amazingly large cones. And the reason I wanted to show it to you on the map is that if you look at the photo on the far right in the center, you can see from a distance these huge cones that are hanging off the ends of the branches. So that's something really makes that tree easy to identify, but they get very tall. They're the longest cones of any pines, and that's pretty cool. We also have a species, Jeffrey pine, which of course I love. This is found more on the east side. This is another more drought tolerant species. It shares a lot of traits with ponderosa pine, actually. And then notably, of course, we have to talk about the coolest species, including giant sequoia. So Sequoiadendron giganteum, which has a very limited distribution. This is a species that is really in danger. Its habitat has just disappeared. You can see its range here in the pink dots. There's only very few discrete populations. And this species doesn't seem to be reproducing a whole lot. So there's some research being done as to what conditions have changed that don't favor regeneration by giant sequoia. But I can tell you, as I was driving into Sequoia National Park, I was riding on the park shuttle. I think that's where it was. And I was looking for giant sequoias, and there's a lot of large trees there, lots of mixed conifers, and I kept wondering, is that it? Is that giant sequoia? And then when you see it, it's just so astounding. it's really hard to describe, but I hope you get to have that experience. Just enormous trees, like where it's really obvious, like, oh, that's definitely the giant sequoia. Just really massive trunks. And so we're going to move on ahead into the subalpine zone. Now, these are the highest elevations before we really get into like gnarly tree lines where there are a few trees, and I'll show you a couple photos, but not a whole lot. So the subalpine zone, if you're looking at it carefully and comparing it to the montane zone, you can see there's a lot more open areas, right? So the canopy is closed in some places, but then it definitely has some openings, and not from, trees coming down necessarily, but you've got a lot of open rock, right? You're getting up into these rocky higher elevations, and tree canopy, it's a lot less diverse. There's not nearly as many species that can hack these high elevation conditions, right? Where winters tend to be harsh. There's lots of snowpack. Don't think there's any broadleaf trees at these elevations. They're all coniferous, right? So they can withstand these pretty deep snowpack. But some of these areas do have some really pretty flowers. So there's alpine wildflowers that take advantage of these openings, to have, very short growing season, but full sunlight. And so these are found at 7,500 to 12,000 feet of elevation, all the way up to the tree line. And that is it's a pretty broad range based on latitude. This photo is taken at Yosemite National Park. And, I pointed out earlier, right? So it's an open forest, right? Widely scattered trees, not always closed canopy. And a really nice habitat for the alpine wildflowers. They do tend to have high levels of snow, and most of the precipitation occurs in the winter through snow. So the trees that live there have to be able to hack those conditions. And another thing I wanted to point out, and this really became evident to me when I was visiting Lake Tahoe a couple years ago, was that there's no spruce in the Sierras, right? So no picea of any kind, right? It's a really important species in the Rockies, but doesn't exist in the Sierra Nevada. So that's kind of surprising. And so the highest elevations tend to have fir, as well as the special species of pine. So the principal species is Abies magnifica. So this photo shows the range map of this species, right? Found at the higher elevations in the Sierra Nevadas and then up into the Cascades. You can identify this species as this is me walking around Lake Tahoe, and you can see it has really big chunky cones that are kind of perched on the ends of the branches. So similar to our Fraser fir in North Carolina, fir cones always perch upright on the branches like little candles. And in this case, they're pretty large, so you could even see them. Those big lumps on the ends of the branches are red fir cones. And also lodgepole pine, another species. This is a species that we learned in lab, and I've put the range map for that here in the bottom right. Lodgepole pine has several different varieties. I think we talked about sand pine and how it's a fire adapted species in some areas. It's interesting, a lot of pine species exhibit some serotiny, so it's not as clear cut as some of the ones that we learned about, like Table Mountain pine, which always has serotinous cones. Lodgepole pine is sometimes serotinous and sometimes it's not. So you can see these serotinous cones, closed cones. This is one that I took in Lake Tahoe, where it's not really considered to be serotinous, but these cones are definitely sealed up really tightly. And you can see the twisted needles and form, right, for Pinus contorta. Lodgepole pine, so this is found in this part of the Sierra Nevada in blue. And then I wanted to added a few photos to some other species. So as I was hiking near Lake Tahoe, I was actually in Nevada hiking the Mount Rose Trail, and I saw this tree, and I was kind of mystified because I know that Picea doesn't exist in the Sierras, but I came across this species with pretty cones that look to me like spruce cones to a degree. And what I realized was that they're mountain hemlock. So it's a new species of hemlock, one I didn't teach. I did consider it. And so this is Tsuga martinesiana. mountain hemlock. And if you look at the tree right here on the left, you can see it's got that drooping tips that hemlocks share. So it's a characteristic that hemlocks share. So these are, to me, it was really interesting because they're up at pretty high elevations. And then this is a really spectacular pine, white bark pine, Pinus abicalis, which was actually just listed as threatened on the endangered species list by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in January of 2023. And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but I mean, look at this cool tree. So this is really getting up to tree line. And so the hike that we did, we got above tree line when we went up to Mount Rose in Nevada, on the Nevada side of Lake Tahoe. But all the way up at the summit, white bark pine takes on this really crazy form. So just to show you that a little bit more. So white bark pine, I'm just going to divert and talk about this species, which is important. It's been, it was listed, interestingly, as threatened due to several compounding factors. And compounding factors are definitely the story in forests. If you really want to understand a forest type, you really have to look at everything that's influencing it. So white bark pine, like you can see these photos at the top, it's got these really cool cones that reminded me a little bit of bristlecone pine, and it's in a similar habitat as well. So here's white bark pine kind of up on the edge. There's a lot of white bark pine in the subalpine forest that I hiked through over here. And you can see if you look closely at this center bottom photo that this is a white pine. And so it has these little clumped needles in fives, which kind of give it a bushy look. And then once you get above tree line, this is actually white bark pine here in the bottom right corner. So it actually gets this prostrate form where it, kind of grows as a little shrubby pine because it's above climatic tree line. So trees really can't hack it at those elevations. The snowpack is too deep. And so it ends up having this really gnarled form. But if I can talk a little bit about its reasons for being threatened. So it is affected by white pine blister rust. And this is a non-native species that is now affecting white bark pines. Now, in the past, white bark pine was too high at too high elevations. The blister rust wasn't able to get up and survive in those cold temperatures. But with the advent of climate change, right, these forests are being invaded by white pine blister rust at much, much higher rates. And so that is really threatening white bark pine. So it can't really migrate any higher or not very quickly. And the white pine blister rust disease is able to survive in warming temperatures that we're seeing from climate change. So, and it's the rust is a non-native species. It's affected by other things as well, but it's a really interesting species. Spread and dispersed by Clark's nutcrackers, which are really cool birds. So let's talk about threats to forests in the Sierra Nevada. So I just talked about climate change. This catastrophic looking fire is actually a prescribed fire. So this prescribed fire looks a lot different than the prescribed fires I've worked on the East Coast. But like I just talked about, white pine blister rust, insects, and disease, their patterns of distribution are changing as a result of climate change and warming temperatures. We also have periods of extended drought. So this is also a contribution of climate change. And then all of these things compound, right? So forests are complicated, and these threats are always really difficult to tease apart. So it's never any one thing. So if you think about it, right, insects and disease and drought contribute to death of the trees that they affect. And in the West Coast, like I said, the precipitation during the growing season is limited. And so you really have a big buildup of fuels. And, the Forest Service has gotten some flack for not managing those fuels on the ground. So they don't break down. And so that means that if you do have a fire, it can be a really catastrophic wildfire that's difficult to control. And so we're seeing that a lot more frequently as a result of changing climate. But another factor that we have to talk about is what the wildland-urban interface. This is especially true in the areas of Chaparral, Southern California. They're really populated areas. And as more and more people move to the area, and this is really true throughout the state of California, as more and more people move there, right, they're building neighborhoods up into these canyons and right against some of these fire-prone habitat. So it's definitely in the chaparral, right? Communities are built up into canyons with chaparral habitat. And so there's vegetation that are around these neighborhoods and homes that is very, very flammable. And so there's a lot of education out there right now about how to have a fire-wise home, where you clear vegetation so you don't have anything that's flammable against the house, and also some buffer areas. And then I just want to reemphasize again that the interactions are what make this fire much more frequent. So you can't really pin it to any one thing, but it's a lot of compounding factors. Again, I linked the current fire map, so you can click on that link and see where there are fires currently. And then I want to show you this bit of research. So this is looking at fire trends from 1984 through 2011. And, you know, because people keep asking the question, like, is fire really more frequent, or, you know, is it more catastrophic? Like, what's really the story here? And so it breaks down forest types and then looks at different geographic areas to see the trends of how many fires do they have. And this is looking at the number of large fires per ecoregion, right? So basically just the number of fires here on the y-axis, and then the year is shown on the x-axis. And interestingly, Mediterranean California, right? So this kind of peach color shown here in the chaparral habitat, right? So these have decreased. And this could be that, you know, these fires have already burned, right? If they're on a 30 to 100 year interval, you know, that maybe some of that habitat has burned up. And so there's a little bit of a decrease there. But if you start looking in the Sierras and Cascades, right, shown in blue, there's definitely been an increase in large scale fires. Now, this could be part of the fire interval. Remember, the fire interval is pretty long in these forests, especially the wetter ones. But, you know, there is been a lot of fuel buildup because those fires are infrequent. And the fuel buildup is part of what makes that catastrophic. So those forests are maybe adapted to these long interval catastrophic wildfires. But I also think it's notable as you look at all of the data in here, and these are not all places that we've had a chance to talk about, but I want to look at the Rocky Mountains, this significant increase in fire since 1984. You can see here in green, lots more fires in the Rockies, and then some other areas that we don't talk about. Most of these ecoregions have seen an increase in fire since the 80s. And I think I've linked the fire down there. And I just wanted to talk a little bit briefly about the Dixie Fire, the 2021 Dixie Fire. I visited this area with my family in 2022, where I went out to Lake Tahoe, and then we drove up to Lassen Volcanic. And I have to say that I've never seen fire effects like these. It's truly devastating to see the scale of the wildfires that we were seeing. So this is the highway driving up towards Lassen Volcanic National Park. And this was kind of the scene for much of our drive once we got out of the Lake Tahoe area and into the, you know, kind of the southern part of the Cascades. So this is just looking through my window. There's a lot of salvage logging going on. I was there the year after the Dixie Fire. And, you know, just really devastating to see the destruction. We drove through towns that basically only had foundations left. It's definitely an environment that we have not really seen this scale of wildfire in the East Coast. And then I just wanted, so this is the drive on the way up, is the big photo. And then in the inset, we did some hiking in Lassen Volcanic National Park. A lot of it, some of the park is closed due to wildfire effects, right? There's a lot of standing dead trees that present a hazard to hikers, but we were able to see quite a lot of it. And I think a lot of this is lodgepole pine. A lot of the trees were impossible to identify, but looking in, you can see this little lake down here at the bottom, which is surrounded by greenery. So there were some wildflowers a year after the fire. But a lot of it, the fire was so severe that it burned into the soil and sterilized it. And so they're not anticipating that recovery will be fast at all. It'll take many, many years for that to occur. And then if you look at this is top inset photo, this is just something I wanted to point out as an interesting, we always think of forests as being kind of static. And you can see all these trees are kind of bent. So this is a really rocky habitat that we were in. You can see there's a few things that are sprouting up, but this is where the fire burned really, really hot. These standing dead trees will be here for quite a long time. Like I said, in the West, things don't deteriorate very quickly. This always surprises me. So I've been out to areas that burn, like, for example, I was in Yellowstone many years ago, but it was, I think, 2 decades after the 1988 fires. And, there's still standing dead trees. Look like the fire had occurred maybe even the year before. But these sloping sites, right, the rocks tend to sort of move downhill with gravity. And so trees sort of get pushed that way. And so they have this really interesting form where they look like they've been kind of bent. And that's from the root systems being pushed a little bit downhill as the tree grows towards the sky. So it's just an interesting thing to see. But this is definitely an area of the forest that was burned very, very hot. Most fires are mosaic, so there are areas that were untouched, but there was a lot less of that traveling through this area in Northern California and the southern part of the Cascades. So just to summarize, and this is a picture of Jeffrey pine, right, which I had to include. This is also taken at Alaskan Volcanic, right? So this is on the eastern side, a little bit drier. Cones are a lot like ponderosa pine, actually. Right, California depends on where you are, broad range of precipitation, but seasonality of precipitation can be very important. If we look into Southern California, the habitat that's really important there is chaparral, which is characterized by evergreen shrubs in the Ericaceae family. These are fire-adapted ecosystems. They burn on a 30 to 100-year interval. We also see that the Sierra Nevada has a higher species diversity than the Rockies, but they still partition along elevation zones. So the elevation zone is a convenient way to study those forest types. And then finally, I don't do, we could have a whole class on wildfires, and there's actually a fire ecology class you can take in NC State. But wildfires are a really serious threat in the Western United States. Generally speaking, we're seeing an increase in the size and frequency of these catastrophic fires. And they are compounded by many factors, and that includes insect and disease outbreaks, which kill large swaths of trees and add to fuel loads. Climate change, which results in extended droughts, which again weakens trees and makes them more susceptible to fire. And then also these are riskier fires because we have this increase in the wildland urban interface. So it's a really complex story, one that I can't do justice to in a single lecture. But this is an ever-changing story, and one that we need to learn more about. So that's all I have, and thanks for tuning in.